Good morning. For this first chapter Friday, we are going to look at Walk Two Moons by Sharon Creech. And with this first chapter Friday, we're going to do something a little bit different and read the first two chapters because the first chapter is so short that I believe you need the first two chapters in order to get an idea of what is happening in this book. The first thing that it starts with is this quote. It has changed a little bit from a common quote that we've all heard. Don't judge someone till you've walked in their shoes. And this is don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Here we are at chapter 1. A face in the window. Graham says that I'm a country girl at heart, and that is true. I have lived most of my 13 years in Bybanks, Kentucky, which is not much more than a caboodle of houses roosting in a green spot alongside the Ohio River. Just over a year ago, my father plucked me up like a weed and took me and all our belongings. No, that is not true. He did not bring the chestnut tree, the willow, the maple, the hayloft, or the swimming hole, all of which belonged to me. And we drove 300 miles straight north and stopped in front of a house in Euclid, Ohio. No trees, I said. This is where we're going to live? No, my father said. This is Margaret's house. The front door of the house opened and a lady with wild red hair stood there. I looked up and down the street. The houses were all jammed together like a row of birdhouses. In front of each house was a tiny square of grass. And in front of that was a thin gray sidewalk running alongside a gray road. Where's the barn? I asked. The river, the swimming hole. Oh, Sal, my father said. Come on, there's Margaret. He waved to the lady at the door. We have to go back. I forgot something. The lady with the wild red hair opened the door and came out onto the porch. In the back of my closet, I said, under the floorboards. I put something there and I've got to have it. Don't be a goose. Come and see Margaret. I did not want to see Margaret. I stood there looking around, and that's when I saw the face pressed up against an upstairs window next door. It was a round girl's face, and it looked afraid. I didn't know it then, but that face belonged to Phoebe Winterbottom, a girl who had a powerful imagination, who would become my friend, and who would have many peculiar things happen to her. Not long ago, when I was locked in a car with my grandparents for 6 days, I told them the story of Phoebe. And when I finished telling them, or maybe even as I was telling them, I realized that the story of Phoebe was like the plaster wall in our old house in Bybanks, Kentucky. My father started chipping away at a plaster wall in the living room of our house in Bybanks shortly after my mother left us one April morning. Our house was an old farmhouse that my parents had been restoring room by room. Each night, as he waited to hear from my mother, he chipped away at that wall. One night that we got the bad news, she was not returning. He pounded and pounded on that wall with a chisel and hammer. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he came up to my room. I was not asleep. He led me downstairs and showed me what he had found. Hidden behind the wall was a brick fireplace. The reason that Phoebe's story reminds me of that plaster wall and the hidden fireplace is that beneath Phoebe's story was another one, mine. Chapter 2. The Chickabiddy Starts a Story. It was after all the adventures of Phoebe that my grandparents came up with a plan to drive from Kentucky to Ohio, where they would pick me up, and then the three of us would drive 2,000 miles west to Lewiston, Idaho. This is how I came to be locked in a car with them for nearly a week. It was not a trip I was eager to take, but it was one I had to take. Grams had said, "We'll see the whole ding dong country." Graham squeezed my cheeks and said, "This trip will give me a chance to be with my favorite chickabiddy again." I am, by the way, their only chickabiddy. My father said that Graham couldn't read maps worth a hill of beans, and that he was grateful that I had agreed to go along with them to help them find their way. I was only 13, and although I did have a way with maps, it was not really because of that skill that I was going, nor was it to see the whole ding dong country that Graham and Gramps were going. The real reasons were buried beneath piles and piles of unsaid things. Some of the real reasons were: 1, Graham and Gramps wanted to see Mama, who was resting peacefully in Lewiston, Idaho. 2, Graham and Gramps knew I wanted to see Mama, but that I was afraid to. And 3, Dad wanted to be alone with the red-headed Margaret Cadaver. He had already seen Mama, and he had not taken me. Also, although this wasn't as important, Dad did not trust Graham and Gramps to behave themselves along the way unless they had me with them. Dad said that if they tried to go on their own, he would have to save everyone a lot of time and embarrassment by calling the police and having them arrested before they even left the driveway. It sounded a bit extreme for a man to call the police on his own tottery old parents. But when my grandparents got in the car, trouble just naturally followed them like a filly trailing behind a mare. My grandparents' Hiddle were my father's parents, full up to the tops of their heads with goodness and sweetness, and mixed in with all that goodness and sweetness was a large dash of peculiarity. This combination made them interesting to know, but you could never predict what they would do or say. Once it was settled that the three of us would go, the journey took on an alarming, expanding need to hurry that was like a walloping great thundercloud assembling around me. During the week before we left, the sound of the wind was hurry, hurry, hurry. And at night, even the silent darkness whispered, rush, rush, rush. I did not think we would ever leave, and yet I did not want to leave. I did not really expect to survive the trip, but I had decided to go and I would go, and I had to be there by my mother's birthday. This was extremely important. I believed if there was any chance to bring my mother back home, it would happen on her birthday. If I had said this aloud to my father or to my grandparents, they would have said I might as well as try to catch a fish in the air. So I did not say it aloud, but I believed it. Sometimes I'm as ornery and stubborn as an old donkey. My father says I lean on broken reeds and will get a full face of swamp mud one day. When at last Graham and Gramps Hiddle and I set out on that first day of the trip, I prayed for the first 30 minutes solid. I prayed that we would not be in an accident. I was terrified of cars and buses. And that we would get there by my mother's birthday, 7 days away, and that we would bring her home. Over and over, I prayed the same thing. I prayed to the trees. This was easier than praying directly to God. There was nearly always a tree nearby. When we pulled onto the Ohio Turnpike, which is the flattest, straightest piece of road in God's whole creation, Graham interrupted my prayers. Salamanca. I should explain right off that my real name is Salamanca Tree Hiddle. Salamanca, my parents thought, was the name of an Indian tribe to which my great-great-grandmother belonged. My parents were mistaken. The name of the tribe was Seneca, but my parents did not discover that error until after I was born, and they were, by then, used to my name, and it remained Salamanca. My middle name, Tree, comes from your basic tree, a thing of such beauty that my mother said she made it part of my name. She wanted to be more specific and use sugar maple tree, her very favorite, but Salamanca sugar maple tree Hiddle was a bit much even for her. My mother used to call me Salamanca, but after she left, only my grandparents Hiddle called me Salamanca when they were not calling me Chickabiddy. To most other people, I was Sal, and to a few boys who thought they were especially amusing, I was Salamander. In the car, we started our long journey to Lewiston, Idaho. My grandmother, Hiddle, said, Salamanca, why don't you entertain us? What sort of thing do you have in mind? Graham said, "How about a story? Spin us a yarn." I certainly do know a heap of stories, but I learned most of them from Gramps. Graham suggested I tell one about my mother. That I could not do. I had just reached the point where I could stop thinking about her every minute of every day. Graham said, "Well, then, what about your friends? You got any tales to tell about them?" Instantly, Phoebe Winterbottom came to mind. There was certainly a hog's belly full of things to tell about her. I could tell you an extensively strange story, I warned. "Oh, good," Graham said. "Delicious." And that is how I happened to suspend my tree prayers and tell them about Phoebe Winterbottom, her disappearing mother, and the lunatic. If you're interested in finding out more about Sal, her mother, her father, Phoebe, her mother, and the lunatic, I suggest that you read Walk Two Moons.